Hi everyone, Evelina from Arcadier here. Today on Inspire, we have Boon Teck Lee. Boon Teck is a partner at professional services group Deloitte and an adjunct professor at Singapore Management University. He has over 20 years of experience with multinational and local listed companies here in Singapore, and spans over an array of industries including automobile, consumer businesses, real estate, and media. Hi Boon Teck.
Hello, hi Evelina, thank you. Hello everyone, I'm really glad to be here today.
We're very glad to have you.
Thanks for having me here.
Our pleasure. So I know that today you want to talk about cash flow and P&L and startups.
That's
right?
Correct, yeah. And why not, I also throw in a little bit about budget forecasting as well, yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
They're definitely very hard areas, especially for people who don't necessarily come from a finance background. So maybe we'll go one by one through these three different topics and then go into how these all relate to startups.
We can do that, yes.
So I guess let's start with cash flow.
Okay.
All right, cool. So what is cash flow?
Now, so Evelina, maybe then let me ask you back. What does cash flow means to you?
Having cash and then the flow of it coming in and going out.
Okay, spot on. See, that's not so hard. No, a lot of my clients tells me that Boon Teck, cash is king. Right now, so how does cash flow and why is cash flow sort of so important to startups? Yeah, we're all aware startups. Startups are essentially businesses that starting with some innovative ideas. You have a business plan that you wish to bring it somewhere into the future, grow it. And in fact, in today's world, a lot of big companies were startups many years ago.
Yeah.
So then, essentially, for startups, cash flows would be very important, right? So Evelina rightfully put it very correctly. So cash flows, when we talk about cash flows, we're talking about cash inflows, and these are mainly funds that comes from your shareholders, from your fundraising exercise and so forth. And then on the other spectrum, you will have cash outflows. Well, then that would include cash payments to talents like yourself, which startups need. And it could be rental, it could be all sorts of startup expenses. Yeah, so that's the component of cash flows.
Got it.
All right.
And then now profit and loss.
Profit and loss. Well, it's the most common question that I always get is, Boon Teck, is profit and loss essentially cash flows? Well, is cash flows essentially profit and loss?
Yeah.
Well, I would say not so. Yeah. So in fact, from an accounting perspective, from a business perspective, whenever we talk about profit and loss, profit and loss, let's take it this way. Profit and loss, it's a measure. It's a measure of the business performance over a period of time. All right. So then the profit and loss would include the revenue, and then you have expenses. Now, to complicate matters a little bit, these may not represent real cash flows. Okay. Why do I say that? Well, because I'm not sure if there are, Evelina, are you aware of the concept of depreciation?
Yes,
okay.
Over time.
Yes, over time. So for example, a startup buys 10 laptops. And then, these 10 laptops, you will not, from an accounting perspective, record it as immediate expenses, although you would have paid full cash for it.
Okay.
All right. However, your laptops are, your boss give you a laptop, he or she will be expecting you to use the laptop for at least the next 3 years. So then from a P&L perspective, you will charge the expenses relating to the purchases of this laptop over 3 years. However, from a cash flow perspective,
it's all at once.
It's all at once. So that's where the complication sets in. Now, why is P&L important? P&L is important because it allows businesses to benchmark themselves, to monitor themselves, and to track themselves over different periods of time. Let's talk about then bring it back to startups.
Okay.
Well, startups, as we all know, the first couple of years, most likely you're not looking at profits. Right? So we're all aware of the term called cash burn. Now, so when a startup is at the infancy stage, so like baby stage, you're growing, then they're almost more certain than never it will be losses.
Yeah.
Right. So for the first couple of years, profit and loss is perhaps not a priority of startups. Now then, as the baby grows, your shareholders, your fund, people who give you funds during fundraising exercises would be expecting to see some results. And then that is where, your profit and loss will become more important. Right, so that's essentially profit and loss.
All right, profit and loss.
Okay.
And then the last bit that you wanted to talk about was forecasting and budgeting, right?
Exactly. Now, forecasting and budgeting. So, what about forecasting and budgeting? How is it relevant to startups? Remember the earlier conversation that we had before the video starts? We were talking about pocket money. All right, so you imagined yourself when you were really young, you get pocket money from your parents, and then in your mind, you will be thinking how to spend that, I don't know, $100, $200, yeah, and then you actually plan. Mm-hmm. So this is essentially what budget and forecasting comes about. Now, it's very important in my view for any startups to have a clear set of budget as well as forecasting. Now, why is it so? It's tantamount to owners of startups looking into the crystal ball and expecting how much funds would come in, and then how would you use the funds wisely, right? To develop the business, to hire talents again like yourself, and to find strategic partners and so forth. And then with a plan, with a budget and forecast, and then you can then monitor cash flows. Then as I mentioned earlier on, as a startup becomes more matured, you have profit and loss, and then you can also benchmark it against your budget to see where the startup is doing and so forth. So essentially, budgets and forecasting, it's sort of a KPI or a plan, that startups have for themselves.
How far in advance would you recommend people to budget or to make their budgets? Because I know that you can do monthly budgets, yearly budgets, 5-yearly.
Good point. Very good question. Now, that there is no sort of a fixed formula as to the period for budget or forecasting. Now, some startups started with a year forecast. Some do 3 years. And as a startup becomes slightly more established, then they do 5 years. Now, important point here is regardless of the period of the budget or the forecast, it is very important for any startups to regularly reforecast and rebudget. Why is that so? Now, the nature of startups is that it's very dynamic. And market conditions nowadays are also very volatile. So then a static budget or a static forecast wouldn't work very well in today's world.
For sure.
Yeah. So I would say there's no fixed time period.
Got it. So regular checkups on your forecasting.
It's like going for regular checkups as well. Health.
So obviously, as you mentioned, everything is very dynamic and forever changing. So with that, in that regard, cash flow can also, sometimes you're not sure when your next round of funding is going to come in. Or how do you what advice would you give to kind of safeguard founders or businesses to kind of, give themselves a little leeway with their cash flow? What's your advice on how to make sure that, cash flow is there and it's flowing and not stagnant? Or you don't get choked up.
Right. Again, I wouldn't say it's an advice. Based off what I've seen because of the work that I do. Now, one of the most common failures of startups, it's 3 words: ran out of cash. Yeah. So from an accounting perspective, we term it as going concern issue. So for owners of startups, it is extremely important to, again, going back to what we were talking earlier on, to have a budget, to budget wisely, and also to do regular reforecasts.
Got it.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So one of the main reasons for failure of startups, as you mentioned, is lack of cash.
Exactly.
What are some of the other reasons or main reasons you see from your observations of why startups fail?
Right. Now, coincidentally, I was, because of this video today, I was doing a little bit of background research myself, and 5 key failure reasons or key failure factors of startups would include, like I mentioned, ran out of cash. Well, it could be also lack of demand of services or product. That's the second one. And then, it also includes not having the right team, the startup. So it boils down to talent. You want the right talent, right? Especially in today's world, talents can be rare. The right talent can be even more rare. Now, the next one, that's intense competition. With all the disruptions that we are seeing around the world, disruptions in technology, disruptions in all sorts of new platforms, new business ideas, and so forth. Now, startups have to always remain vigilant and flexible in adapting to changes and so forth.
Right.
So again, intense competition has been highlighted as one of the factors for key failures. Last but not least, inappropriate pricing or strategy. Yeah. So that speaks a lot for itself. For a startup to be able to price its services, its products wisely at an appropriate level, I would say is an art. And henceforth, again, it goes back to what we were talking about. The cash flows, the forecasts, the budgets are all very relevant to prevent failures of startups, which will address the 5 key factors that I've just shared.
Got it.
All right.
So very interesting. The top 5 reasons of why companies fail: lack of demand, cash, team,
Intense
competition, and inappropriate pricing. So maybe we can talk about team.
Okay.
All right. So obviously, hiring right talent is important. How does that all play into cash flow, budgeting, forecasting, and everything? And how can that, how can you make it so that you can attract the right talent? Because obviously that's very, very important.
Yeah, it is. Now, so recently, I was in Hong Kong about a month ago, and I met up with again, this is an owner of a startup. So then, he was asking me with regards to how big should his initial team be, right? And because by virtue of my training, so he was asking me how experienced should he start to get just an accountant. Should he start with his team with a controller, and when would he need a CFO? Right. And for the time being, he's doing everything himself. So that sort of gives a little bit of an angle as to the topic of the right team.
Right.
Yeah. So again, at his stage of the startup, it's really at the infancy stage. He doesn't have that much of a budget. So it boils down to budget. Yeah. So he's had probably just 1-2 rounds of funding, and henceforth, the discussion with him was that he probably want to be a little bit more prudent in terms of using the newly raised funds. And given that the startup was at the very infancy stage, perhaps he will need a finance manager or an accountant that will be able to help him chart the startup forward in terms of budgeting and
Yeah.
reforecasting. So remember earlier on I mentioned about a different stage of a startup. Then you will probably need different talents.
Very true.
Right.
So I guess on that subject, what do you think are the higher priority budgetings that people should take into consideration, or what should they prioritize, do you think?
I personally, my view is again this would largely depend on the stage of where the startup is, and depends on what type of business, the startup is in. Now, for startups whereby that needs slightly more capital investments in terms of electronic platforms and so forth, and then for those cases, perhaps then a little bit more focus of budget would be sort of allocated to developments, platform developments and so forth. And these would also sort of shape the kind of talents that you may want to bring. Yeah. So again, I would say there will not be a mold that fits all.
For sure.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of startups, because everything everything changes sometimes by the day.
Very much so.
And I suppose that's that excitement that probably sort of attracts you and the reason why you're here. Yeah.
So out of the other 5 main reasons that you mentioned, what else do you think is particularly interesting and related to those 3 main points of cash flow, budgeting and forecasting, and P&L?
Right. Now, one the very important aspects for startups, again, it's the relationship, the networking that owners of startups will need to have. Why is that so? Now, again, like I was mentioning, the first couple of years, what you need is money, funding.
Yep. Funding.
And this doesn't come automatically.
Nope.
Nope. Now, and then where do you go get all these fundings? So I believe the networking. Yep. How do you sell your idea? How do you present your ideas to interested parties who will be willing to invest, who buys into your story, your vision?
Yeah.
So that, to me, it's very important.
How to pitch.
Exactly.
Very important. So going back to the topic of budgeting, I know that a lot of new businesses and startups, the CEOs or entrepreneurs are the leaders, and they normally are on a very tight budget, as we all know and are. How would you advise people to price their own salaries? Because obviously this is something that's very difficult for a lot of people. Sometimes you're coming from a big corporate job, or you're just starting up, but you obviously have to make the bills, and you can try to bootstrap as much as you can, but sometimes you do need to give yourself a salary. So how would you recommend pricing your own salary?
I don't know. No, that's a tough one. Why I say it's a tough one? Again, it varies from startups to startups, and it varies from owners to owners. Yeah. Now, what I've seen is it really depends on what the owners of the startups have in mind. Yeah. Very often, more often than never, many of the startup owners leave their corporate jobs, as you rightfully mentioned. Well, and many of them sort of give themselves a period of time. It could be 2 years, it could be 3 years, and I'm aware some of them didn't really draw a salary for as long as 2-3 years. So that's the reality. There is no formula as to how you sort of price your own salary and so forth. What I would say again is extremely important is to look at the set of budget that startups should have or must have Yeah, when they thought of sort of first when they were born, as a newborn maybe, you need to have a set of budget, and then along the way, depending on the amount of funding that comes in, the stage of development of your ideas, and the likelihood of you being able to commercialize the ideas, that would then determine how much you can decide to pay yourself.
Do you think that in the beginning, like like it should just, as a percentage of your total cash or available funds, it should be lower, and then as you grow, it can slowly grow, and that kind of elastic relationship?
I would agree. Yeah, largely, like you rightfully pointed out, it's an elastic relationship. Yeah, and let's face it. We look at some of the big corporations that started off as startups. Yeah, the business owners back then, as you read their stories, it's no difference from what we're talking about here. Yeah, so again, it's a very elastic relationship, and bearing in mind, many startups fail. So I would say for owners of startup, it's a risk. Yeah, that he or she will have to take.
Of course. I mean, I think that's just, I guess that's part of what we all take on as being part of a startup, is that you never really know. A new business, you never know how it's going to go.
Exactly. Well, we only live once.
Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to talk about was obviously forecasting, as you mentioned, is extremely, extremely important. But no one really, you can't really know what the future has in store for anyone.
Right.
So how much importance and how much priority should people actually put in on, trying to forecast and make their KPIs? And if they don't reach them, like how does that affect everything else?
Right. I would say give high, or in fact very high priority to this part of the business in terms of forecasting, measuring of KPI, remeasurement of KPIs, and so forth. Now it is extremely important because for startups, especially at the earlier stage, your funds are finite.
Yep.
So then therefore, going back to our focus earlier on that we mentioned, every dollar, every cent counts. So as the saying goes, you should cut your pain earlier. Now, so for example, I mentioned earlier on not having the right team. Yeah. So if you have a few employees or a few talents that's not so performing up to mark. Now, at some point in time, when you look at the forecast or reforecast, and certain numbers are not, or certain business objectives are not being met, at some point in time, the owners will need to make a decision. So that's where I suppose we're coming from. So it's very important, to always reforecast and to look at where the startup is tracking along.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then it brings me back again to perhaps the profit and loss, how you benchmark your profit and loss, perhaps to your budgets, and looking at your cash flows, whether your net cash inflow or whether it's the startup consistently in a cash outflow position over a long period of time.
I guess that's a very good point, because I think a lot of times people, or businesses, we tend to, you're always focused on the day-to-day, and then you kind of think, oh, I'll see how it goes. But it is very much important to set those goals, see how you perform against them, and then keep on setting them so you can look back, and then hopefully make wiser decisions in the future as to how to then move forward.
Good point there. So we human beings are always sort of we function by learning from the past, focus on the future, and then we look forward. Focus on the present, and then look forward to the future. So that's that learning and constant readjustment. It is very, very key.
Okay, so a practical question that I have is, obviously not everybody is an accountant.
Okay.
So what are do you have any practical advice or ways for people to quickly, if they are just starting, what are some basics about cash flow, P&L, and forecasting, and what should they be tracking?
Right. Well, good point. That there probably I've this whole list of things that startups should track, should be always constantly tracking. Now again, unfortunately, there's no one size fits all kind of thing. There's no fixed formula. I would say again from a cash flow perspective, a very key observation that startups should always pay attention to, it's the nature of cash outflows and inflows.
Okay, what do you mean by nature?
Okay, so when we talk about cash outflows, now from an accounting angle, we largely categorize them into different buckets: investing, operating, and financing.
Okay.
So then depending again where the stage of the startup is, you want to focus on a particular sort of a stage or a particular segment. I would think again from a startup perspective, the very initial years, you will probably need quite a fair bit of operating cash flow. Not so much investing from that perspective. Again, depending on the type of business the startup is. Right. So then that's cash flow. It's very important to constantly monitor, and then sit back and reflect whether the different categories of cash inflows and outflows, is it going in accordance with your business plan?
Okay.
Right.
On the subject of business plan, we all hear about it, and obviously everybody creates one. What do you think are the main mistakes that people make or kind of forget about when they're making their business plan?
Well, I would say it's important again for startups to have a business plans that takes into account what we term as sensitivity analysis. So you really want a business plan that is that takes into different scenarios if you can.
What kind of scenarios typically would you want them to be looking at, or would you advise people to look at?
Right. So it's, for example, how much funding do you need? Yeah, from a business plan perspective, and if you don't hit this minimum level of funding, then what are your alternatives? Do you downsize? Do you then not have an office and so forth? So that's where I'm coming from a business plan perspective. And then at which stage should you then go to the market? Should you then look at the next round of funding and so forth? Now, sometimes business plans are where I'm coming from is business plans should not be rigid. So henceforth, then it goes back, it ties in with, now one element of business plans would be your budgets and your forecasts. And if your budgets and forecasts are constantly changing, then as it fits into your business plans, right, then your business plans would also change over time.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So that's that. So it's all a learning process again. Yeah, for everybody.
I think it's the same. It's very much similar to how you build the product and business, and what we keep on hearing from our other speakers is these fast learning cycles about everything. And sometimes I think finances and business plans get you kind of more focused on the product itself and what you're learning from the customers versus maybe what you're learning from your own finances and what's going on from the business.
Totally agree.
So it's very interesting because I think sometimes we make a business plan, we're like, okay, this is the plan, and then you kind of just let it sit on the side for a little bit.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So again, that brings me to one point with regards to the key difference between a startup and a very established business. Yeah, for businesses that are already very established, what they have, which sometimes can be a little bit, depending on how you look at it, advantage over startups is the reserves that they may have over the years. Yeah. So they can afford to sort of make a few changes, U-turns and so forth. Yeah, or they may be able to adopt wait and see kind of approach to ride difficult times out.
Right.
Now, startups, on the other hand, it's totally different.
Yeah, they don't have that luxury.
Because the reserve of the funding is finite. So you're absolutely right.
Oh, sorry, guys. Okay, so wrapping things up. So if you had to just very in basic form, kind of prioritize, cash flow, P&L, budgeting, forecasting for the different stages of a startup, how would you, as the life cycle goes, how would you prioritize it?
Okay, that's as I was mentioning earlier on, for a startup that is newborn. So I always imagine the journey like a newborn maybe. So for a newly sort of a born startups, budget forecasting, my view, would take priority.
Okay.
Number one, because you need to plan forward.
Yep.
Yep. So when you're a baby, you have not much past to talk about.
Yep.
And all you have is looking into the future. So you need to plan for the future. Profit and loss, not so relevant as at that point in time. Right? The cash flow is important. So again, budget forecasting, cash flow, then maybe profit and loss.
Got it.
As the baby become a toddler, they become a teenager.
Yeah.
Let's talk about teenager stage. Yeah. So for teenager stage, that's where you take stock.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where you take stock. You look at what's happening for the past couple of years, maybe, and then you reforecast. So I would say forecast budget continues to be very important. I will place them maybe number one again.
Okay.
Right. Cash flow continues to be equally important, or not number two.
Okay.
Okay, and then even as a teenager, at the teenager stage, a startup may still not be in a position to generate profits. So then, profit and loss, I would say it becomes slightly more important, but however, it's not the most important.
Yeah, maybe you're starting to get users and maybe you're starting to get your name out there, but it's still very much a lost game.
Yes,
And you're trying
exactly.
to get in, show that you have that history to then grow.
Exactly. And then once you become an adult, the expectation is you go out there, get a job and earn money. So then what happens? And then that is where I would say the profit and loss perhaps just gets pushed up. Number two, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. And then that is where you're expected to show some results. Yeah. Your shareholders will be expecting to see something back. Cash flow would also perhaps be number two, because at that stage, if you're able to already go out to the market, your shareholders will be looking at a little bit or somewhat some returns. So there may be some payouts, maybe some whatever form of returns. So I would then rank profit and loss and cash flows equal.
Okay.
Okay. Now then, forecast budget continues to be very important. That's my personal, always very important. Yeah. And then the story continues.
Got it.
All right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very interesting to know that, I think that budgeting and forecasting, of course, is on everybody's mind, but sometimes you just kind of, you're like, oh, I can't figure out what the future is going to be like.
It's tough. Yeah. Essentially looking into a crystal ball. Yeah. That's life, fortunately. Yeah.
All right, so to wrap things up, I just have one last question, which is, what's one piece of advice that you'd like to share with everybody today?
Okay. Well, I wouldn't say it's advice. I would say it's perseverance, being positive, very, very important. Sometimes, it's the energy, the positiveness that gets anyone over difficult times. So then, to conclude, it depends on how you look at it. It can either be a problem to you or it can be a challenge. Easier said than done. That's the mentality that all of us should have and embrace, especially for startups.
Very, very true. Very good advice. All right, everyone. It's been Boon Teck Lee here talking about cash flow, profit and loss, budgeting, and forecasting. We hope that today you've learned a little something that hopefully helps you out. And don't forget to persevere and be positive throughout your entire journey. So if anybody wanted to reach out to you to maybe learn a little bit more or just ask some questions, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Absolutely, my pleasure. If any one of you would like to reach out to me, the best way, LinkedIn.
All right, wonderful. You can find Boon Teck on LinkedIn. And that's all that we have for today on Inspire. Thank you again, Boon Teck.
Thank you and good luck, everyone. I'm already inspired.
Oh, wonderful. So everyone, persevere, think positive. Don't let, your journey is long.
Yes.
So perseverance. That's all that we have for today. Thank you for joining us again. And until next time, be inspired.